The message from Michael appeared on Ellie's phone, short and simple. "We want to make things right, Mom. We'll meet you at the Penthouse for dinner. Please let us talk." Ellie stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. Every part of her wanted to ignore it, but something made her pause. After all these years of manipulation, the weight of his words felt like a trap. Yet part of her still clung to a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could have a real conversation. She set her phone down. Her eyes drifted to the large windows of her penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. Manhattan, in all its grandeur, seemed so small compared to the turmoil inside her. She had built this life, this sanctuary for herself, and yet it had been invaded time and time again by the very people she had loved most. A quiet breath escaped her lips. She wasn't foolish. She knew their game, but she would face it head-on tonight. She would listen, not to forgive, but to finally take control. The clock ticked. Dinner was still an hour away. Ellie moved around the apartment with practiced ease, preparing herself in silence. No flashy gestures, no emotional outbursts, just her, alone in her space. She poured herself a glass of red wine, savoring the richness of it, as if it could somehow drown the bitterness that had become all too familiar. As she stood in the kitchen, the weight of the years of enabling them, of letting them take, crashed over her again. They had expected too much. She had given too much. A sound outside caught her attention. A car pulling up in front of her building. It was them. The moment had arrived. Ellie set her glass down and walked calmly to the door. When she opened it, Michael and Kate stood there, dressed to impress, the kind of smiles they wore when they wanted something. It was always a game to them. "Mom, it's been too long," Michael said, his voice smooth, polished, like it was rehearsed. Kate leaned in, her smile warm but carrying that familiar edge of expectation. "We've missed you, Ellie. We've been through so much. It's time to make things right." Ellie didn't speak immediately. She simply stepped aside to let them in. They entered, and Ellie closed the door quietly behind them. She didn't have to say much. The air in the penthouse shifted, filled with tension. Ellie stood still, observing them both, carefully measuring her next words, her next actions. "Well, let's sit down," Ellie said calmly, her voice steady. As Michael and Kate took their seats at the dining table, Ellie remained standing. The room was elegant, untouched by the tension they had created over the years. She could see the cracks in their facade, the impatience in Michael's eyes, the subtle hope in Kate's smile. Ellie sat down, a deliberate gesture, settling into the head of the table with a quiet authority. She wouldn't be swayed by their charm or their empty apologies. Tonight was about her. For the first time in years, she was in control. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Ellie's eyes met Michael's, and for the first time, she didn't feel the pull of guilt. She only felt the weight of her own strength, and with that, she knew. This conversation wasn't about healing. It was about closing the door for good. Michael and Kate stepped into the penthouse with the same practiced ease they always had, but tonight, Ellie saw through it. Their smiles were too polished, too rehearsed. Michael's voice carried that familiar smoothness, one that had often worked in the past. "We've realized we were wrong," he said, glancing at Kate before turning his attention back to Ellie. "We want to make things right." Kate nodded eagerly, her expression a mixture of regret and subtle expectation. "It's been a difficult time, Ellie. We've been through so much, and family should come first." Ellie didn't move, didn't speak immediately. She kept her gaze steady, watching them both. Her silence stretched, thick and deliberate. They expected her to soften, to hear them out as the mother they knew. But Ellie had changed. She wasn't the same woman who would have immediately opened her arms to them. Kate, sensing her hesitation, leaned forward just a little. "Things have been hard for us financially. We've had to cut back a lot, and, Well, we were hoping you might consider helping us again." The words hit Ellie like a slap, though she didn't let them show. This was the game, always a play for money, always dressed up in emotional appeals. "I'm sorry to hear that," Ellie said quietly, her voice firm, "but I can't help you this time." Michael's face tightened for a second before he caught himself, slipping back into that familiar mask of calm. "Come on, Mom. You've always been there for us. We're asking for your support, just like before." Ellie's eyes never left his. "You're asking for money, Michael. Again." Kate shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. But Ellie was beyond caring. She wasn't here to coddle their guilt or play the role of the generous mother anymore. "I've helped you both more times than I care to count," Ellie continued, her voice steady but unyielding. "And every time it's been the same. You take, you ask for more, and when I don't give, you make me feel guilty for not being there. But not this time. Not anymore." Michael glanced at Kate, his frustration now starting to show. "You're really turning your back on your family? On your only son?" Ellie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words that had haunted her for so long, but this time, they felt different, stronger. "I'm not turning my back, Michael. I'm setting boundaries. This is about me, about my peace, and I'm not going to sacrifice it for you anymore." The room grew still. Ellie could see their desperation, their disbelief, but there was no going back now. She had made the decision, and it wasn't up for negotiation. Kate's face hardened, but she forced a smile. "Well, if that's how it's going to be, that's how it's going to be," Ellie interrupted, standing taller, her posture firm and resolute. Michael and Kate exchanged a look, one that Ellie knew all too well, the silent communication that always preceded their attempts to twist her arm. But this time, she wasn't playing along. "You've crossed the line," Ellie said, her voice low but clear, "and I'm not going to let you drag me back into your web of lies and manipulation. Not anymore." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of the truth Ellie had just spoken. Neither Michael nor Kate moved, but Ellie could see their disappointment turning into something darker. And just like that, Ellie knew this was the last time she would ever be part of their games, the last time they would control her. Her heart was calm, finally, at peace. The air in the penthouse grew heavy, thicker with each word exchanged. Michael's and Kate's smiles had dissolved completely, replaced by a quiet but insistent tension that Ellie could feel pressing against her chest. They hadn't taken her refusal seriously yet, and Ellie knew exactly where this was headed. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his expression no longer masked by charm. "You're not seriously doing this, are you, Mom? We're your family. We just want to fix things. Why can't you just help us out this one last time?" Kate's voice, ever so sweet, slid in next. "Ellie, we've been struggling for so long. It's hard to make ends meet, and we can't do it alone. You've always been there for us before. Why turn your back now?" Ellie's pulse remained steady, but her gaze sharpened, fixed on them like a blade. She had heard this pitch before. It wasn't new. It was their usual plea, wrapped in false remorse and desperation. But this time, Ellie wasn't buying it. Not anymore. She stood up slowly, her movement deliberate. "I've given you everything, Michael. Everything I could, but I've had enough." Her voice carried no wavering, only clarity. "You're not getting another dime. Not now, not ever." A tense silence stretched between them. Michael's hands curled into fists on the table, frustration flaring in his eyes. Kate's face tightened, but she said nothing. Ellie's words hung in the air, thick with finality. Without a word, Ellie turned toward the corner of the room where her phone rested, on the edge of the polished marble counter. She picked it up, her fingers moving with practiced ease to dial a familiar number. As she hit the call button, her eyes never left Michael and Kate, who were both watching her closely, the silence now growing heavier with their unspoken accusations. On the other end, Aaron's voice rang clear and calm. "Ellie, what's going on? I need you here. Ellie said simply. "Now." Without hesitation, Aaron responded, "I'll be there in 5." Ellie didn't wait for a response. She set the phone back down, her gaze locking with Michael's, his face twisted with the irritation that Ellie had learned to recognize so well. "You really think you can just shut us out, Mom?" Michael's voice was tight, angry now. "We're family. You can't just turn your back like this." Ellie remained calm. "I've given you everything. Now I'm giving you nothing." Her words were precise, like a cutting edge, each syllable a reminder of the finality in her decision. She could feel the shift in the room, the palpable rise in tension, the anger brewing beneath Michael's composed exterior. Kate was still silent, her expression shifting from disbelief to resentment. The silence between them became almost unbearable. But Ellie didn't flinch. She had made her choice. Aaron arrived, his presence filling the doorway like a shield. He didn't need to say a word. His calm demeanor and towering presence were enough to speak volumes. Ellie's gaze flicked toward Aaron as he entered the room, his eyes scanning the space for any signs of escalation. His subtle movements, his very presence, sent a clear signal. This wasn't a conversation that was going to go any further. Michael shot a quick, resentful look at Aaron, his frustration bubbling over. "Are you really going to let her do this, Aaron? You're just going to stand by and let her shut us out?" Aaron didn't budge, his eyes cool and steady. "This conversation's over, Michael." Ellie, standing tall and unshaken, turned to face the door. She felt no guilt, no hesitation, only a clear sense of empowerment. She had drawn her line, and no matter how much they tried to cross it, she wasn't moving. Michael opened his mouth, but Ellie's voice rang out before he could speak. "You've had your chance, both of you. I'm done. This is over." The door clicked shut behind her as she stepped away from the confrontation. But even as the door closed, she knew it wasn't truly over. Not yet. This was just the beginning. The final act was still to come. The quiet in the penthouse was almost suffocating after Michael and Kate left. The absence of their constant demands, the weight of their expectations. It was a relief, but a strange one. Ellie sat in the stillness, her eyes drifting over the city skyline, the lights of Manhattan flickering like distant stars. Her phone buzzed again, Michael's name. She didn't even need to look at the message to know what it said. Another apology, another attempt to manipulate her. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she set the phone down with a deliberate motion, letting it ring unanswered. Every instinct told her to pick it up, to hear him out, to at least listen. But Ellie had already heard it all. She'd heard the lies, the pleas, the promises. This time, there was nothing to say. The call went to voicemail. A few moments later, Michael's voicemail beeped, and Ellie knew his message would only repeat what he'd already said. How sorry he was. How things had to change. How family was everything. But it was always the same. He was sorry when he needed something, but never when he didn't. With a sigh, Ellie stood up, moving toward the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of wine, the familiar warmth of the red liquid settling her nerves. She was done. Done with all of it. But she knew it was only just beginning. They wouldn't let her go so easily. Ellie walked over to her desk and picked up her phone again. This time, she called Grace, the lawyer who had helped Ellie keep her life and her business secure all these years. "Ellie," Grace's voice came through clear and steady. "What's going on?" Ellie leaned against the desk, her fingers resting lightly on the cool surface. "I didn't answer," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not going back. I can't. But they're not going to stop. Michael's already called again." Grace was quiet for a moment, then spoke with a tone of quiet certainty. "You're right. They'll keep pushing. You've given them so much, and they think they can keep taking. It's time to take back control." Ellie's grip on the phone tightened. "I need to make sure they can't touch anything of mine anymore. I'm going to revise my estate plan, Grace. Remove Michael and Kate from it entirely. I've done enough for them." "Good," Grace said. "We'll make sure it's watertight. They won't get a dime without a fight." Ellie nodded even though Grace couldn't see her. This was the right decision. She felt the weight of it, but it was freeing. The last thing she needed was to keep living for them, always trying to fill their insatiable needs. "I'm ready," Ellie said, her voice resolute. "I've spent too long catering to their demands. It ends now." As the conversation ended, Ellie looked out at the skyline once more, the lights below reflecting the clarity in her mind. For the first time in years, she wasn't second-guessing herself. She had made her decision, and now she would protect everything she had built. No more exceptions, no more guilt. She took a deep breath, feeling the calm settle in her chest. It wasn't just about protecting her wealth, it was about protecting herself. But as she turned to walk back toward her desk to finalize the changes, one thought lingered in the back of her mind. How far would Michael and Kate go to break her resolve? She wasn't afraid anymore. Ellie's fingers hovered over the phone, steady but resolute as she made the call to her bank. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, but Ellie's request was swift, without hesitation. "I need to revoke all access to my credit cards. Both Michael and Kate's names," she said, her tone final. There was a brief pause. "Understood. Is there anything else you'd like to modify today?" "Yes," Ellie replied. "Freeze all joint accounts and transfer the remaining assets into a trust, an irrevocable trust with an ironclad no-access clause." The representative confirmed quickly, processing the request without any pushback. Ellie ended the call with a calm certainty. As she set the phone down, she felt the weight in her chest lighten for the first time in years. She had just severed their last link to her wealth. There would be no more calls asking for help, no more manipulation. She would protect herself, no matter the cost. Ellie stood up and walked over to the window, her gaze sweeping over the glowing Manhattan skyline. The city felt distant, almost foreign now. She'd spent too long bending to their demands. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. A message from Michael. "We're family, Ellie. This isn't how things are supposed to go." Ellie read the words, but they didn't stir the familiar guilt. Instead, a small, steady smile tugged at her lips. She wasn't buying their script anymore. She didn't respond. Not this time. Instead, Ellie dialed Grace, the lawyer who had kept her business, her life, secure. "Ellie?" Grace's voice was calm, as expected. "What's the next step?" "The accounts are frozen. The assets are in the trust," Ellie replied, her voice steady. "I'm done. I've made the changes." There was a pause on the other end, Grace processing the decision. "Good," she said finally. "I'll make sure your will is updated, excluding Michael and Kate entirely. It will be airtight." Ellie nodded, though Grace couldn't see it. "I don't care what they say. My peace is worth more than their demands." "That's the right call," Grace affirmed. "This is about protecting yourself now." Ellie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her decision had been made. She wasn't going to let guilt or obligation keep her tethered to them any longer. She looked out at the city once more, a slight breeze brushing against her skin. The weight she'd carried for so long was lifting, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Ellie's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a notification, an update on her apartment key cards. She'd just canceled their access, a final boundary that couldn't be crossed. She moved toward the desk, her fingers tapping out a quick message to Aaron. "Tighten security, no more surprises." Aaron's reply came almost instantly. "Understood, I'll handle it." Ellie stood in the silence, letting it wash over her. She was done being manipulated. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie knew the battle was far from over. Michael and Kate would come back, pushing harder, testing her resolve. But this time, she was ready. She would stand firm. The line had been drawn and it would not be crossed. The phone calls from Michael and Kate became more frequent, each one carrying the same emotional weight: guilt, manipulation, desperation. Ellie let them ring through, ignoring each one. She had made her decision, and nothing would make her change it. Not anymore. But their persistence only intensified. A few days later, Ellie's phone buzzed again, a bank alert flashing across the screen. Fraudulent transaction attempt detected on your account. Her heart skipped as she opened the details. Michael's name was attached to the attempt. She quickly logged into her bank account. Her stomach sank. A request had been made from an unfamiliar device, attempting to access her assets. Without hesitation, she froze all accounts and called the fraud department. She couldn't believe they'd crossed that line. The representative confirmed the details, and Ellie instructed them to lock everything down. But the weight of what Michael and Kate had done hit hard. They had gone too far. As Ellie processed the situation, her phone buzzed again. It was Aaron. Ms. Williams, Michael and Kate are trying to breach security. Multiple attempts to enter the building. I've got it under control, but be aware. Ellie stood still, a chill running through her. She had expected this, but the reality of it left her unsettled. Michael and Kate weren't giving up. They didn't care about boundaries, only what they could take. Keep them out, Ellie said firmly, and keep me updated. She walked toward the window, her mind racing. Her phone buzzed once more, this time a message from Michael. I'm your only son. You can't do this to me. You're abandoning me when I need you most. Ellie read the words, and for a brief moment she felt the familiar tug of guilt, but she pushed it aside. She had given him everything, her love, her resources, her time, and he had taken it all for granted. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for someone who only saw her as a means to an end. Her fingers hovered over the phone as she typed her response. I've made my decision. This is over. She hit send and set the phone down, a quiet sense of finality settling over her. She couldn't let them back in. She wouldn't. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Michael and Kate didn't give up. More calls, more texts, each more frantic than the last, but Ellie kept ignoring them. She had done enough. She couldn't be their emotional or financial crutch any longer. Ellie received another alert from her bank, warning her of a second attempt, this time a fraudulent charge to one of her credit cards. She didn't need to check the details. She already knew who was behind it. Michael. The reality hit her harder now. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. They wanted to force their way back into her life, to bend her to their will, but Ellie wasn't going to let them. The phone buzzed again, and she saw Michael's name on the screen. This time, Ellie didn't even glance at the message. She'd already made her decision. She had already drawn her line. She wasn't going back. The silence that followed felt like peace, a peace she had fought for and one she would hold on to at all costs. The weeks that followed Michael and Kate's final attempt to breach Ellie's life were a revelation. The emptiness that had once threatened to suffocate her now felt like a canvas, blank and waiting to be filled with something new. The phone calls and text messages grew fewer, but their echo lingered, the quiet hum of a past that had been left behind. For the first time in years, Ellie felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: freedom. She took time for herself, stepping out of the routine that had once centered around meeting others' demands. Her mornings were no longer consumed with checking messages or responding to calls. Instead, she spent hours reading books she had long ignored, exploring her business in new directions, and reigniting passions she'd buried under years of obligation. She traveled, solo trips to places she'd only dreamed of before, sitting at outdoor cafes in Paris, wandering the streets of Rome, and strolling through the quiet galleries of New York's lesser-known art museums. Every place she visited was a reminder of the woman she used to be, the woman who had lived for herself before everything had been taken from her. Ellie made new friends, too, people who understood her boundaries, who respected her choices, and who never asked for anything beyond simple companionship. She dined with them, laughing over shared bottles of wine, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. These were friendships based on mutual respect, not need. But it wasn't just the enjoyment of freedom that Ellie craved. She also found purpose in giving back. She'd always wanted to mentor young women in business, but the demands of her past life had kept her from pursuing that dream. Now, with time on her side, she began offering advice to women just starting their careers, those who reminded her of the young woman she had once been, eager to succeed, but without the knowledge of how to navigate the pitfalls of the world. Ellie started small, hosting seminars at local community centers, sharing her experiences, and offering guidance that she never had. It was raw, real, and her advice resonated with those who attended. But she didn't stop there. As her confidence grew, so did her desire to make a more substantial difference. Ellie launched a nonprofit charity to help women who were struggling financially, those who needed guidance on managing money, building a career, and finding independence. The charity became her new focus, filling the void in her life that Michael and Kate's endless demands had once occupied. Through the charity, Ellie offered workshops, financial planning sessions, and one-on-one coaching. She gave women the tools they needed to make smart decisions, to take back control of their lives in ways she hadn't been able to before. It was fulfilling in ways she had never expected. She no longer felt the weight of her past. The chains of guilt and obligation had finally fallen away. Ellie began to embrace the quiet peace that had once seemed so foreign to her. It was as if, for the first time, she was truly alive, not living in service to others, but living for herself. But even as she walked through her days with a sense of joy and calm, Ellie knew it wasn't over. Michael and Kate hadn't given up. They were still out there, waiting, pushing, testing her resolve. Ellie had set her boundaries, but she had learned that they wouldn't stop unless she proved she could stand firm, forever. As she stood at the window one evening, the city lights casting a soft glow across her penthouse, Ellie felt a subtle unease stir in her chest. She wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore, but the feeling was there. She knew something was coming, an attempt to break her peace, to force her back into their world. Ellie was ready. She had faced them before, and she would face them again, but this time it would be on her terms. She had the life she wanted. The question now was how much they would try to take from her, and how far she was willing to go to protect it. The letter arrived one chilly afternoon, tucked between the usual stack of bills and invitations. Ellie sat at her desk, fingers lingering over the envelope, her name written in Michael's familiar looping script. She hadn't heard from him or Kate in weeks, no calls, no messages. Yet here it was, a final attempt to reach her. She opened it slowly, feeling the weight of what it represented. Inside, the words were carefully chosen, each one an attempt to appeal to the mother she once was. Michael's apology was wrapped in excuses, his regrets veiled in promises of change. Kate's note, brief but sweet, echoed a similar sentiment. We've realized the hurt we caused. We're sorry, and we hope you can forgive us. Ellie held the paper in her hands, the words blurring as she stared at them. She had expected guilt to rise in her, but instead she felt nothing but relief. The guilt, the obligation, the constant pressure to perform for them, it was all gone. They no longer had any hold on her. For the first time in years, Ellie wasn't torn between love and duty. She wasn't trying to justify their behavior or apologize for her boundaries. She didn't have to explain why she could no longer be their emotional or financial crutch. She folded the letter back and placed it in the trash, the motion quiet but decisive. No response, no forgiveness. She was done. With the weight of the past finally lifted, Ellie moved forward. She traveled. The places she'd dreamed of were now hers to explore. Each trip, whether to the beaches of Greece, the mountains of Switzerland, or the quiet villages in Italy, was a reaffirmation of her newfound independence. She walked without the constant gnawing of responsibility at her side. One sunny morning, she found herself at a business conference, standing before a crowd of eager, ambitious women. They looked at her with wide eyes, hungry for her advice, for her story. She told them everything, the rise of her business, the lessons she'd learned, and most importantly, how she had rebuilt herself after years of sacrifice. Her words were raw, honest, and real. As she spoke, Ellie felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This was why she had fought so hard to reclaim her life. The standing ovation she received at the end of her talk was not just for the words she'd spoken, but for the woman she had become. Michael and Kate's lives, by contrast, continued to spiral. Ellie heard whispers about their struggles, Michael's latest failed venture, Kate's growing frustration with their financial woes. They had once been a constant presence in her life, but now they were shadows in the background. Their attempts to re-enter her world were becoming more desperate, but Ellie didn't flinch. She had no reason to care anymore. As she stood in front of the hotel window that evening, looking out at the sparkling city lights below, Ellie reflected on how far she had come. The weight of her family's demands, the emotional toll they'd taken on her, felt like a distant memory. She had let them define her for so long, and now, for the first time, her happiness was her own responsibility. She smiled to herself, the realization settling in like a comforting weight. No one had the power to take this from her anymore. Ellie wasn't just free, she was thriving. But as she turned away from the window, something tugged at her, a nagging feeling that the end of her story wasn't quite written yet. Michael and Kate hadn't given up, and Ellie knew in some quiet corner of her mind that they would be back, but this time she would be ready. Ellie sat at her desk, the document spread before her like a map of her future. Her pen hovered over the final lines of her will, an act of finality, a decision that would seal the life she had painstakingly rebuilt. She was no longer making decisions out of fear, guilt, or obligation. This was hers to control entirely. Her fingers brushed the ink as she signed her name. It was a simple act, but one that held the weight of years of sacrifice, pain, and a determination to live on her own terms. Ellie had meticulously planned every detail. Her estate would be protected from any future interference, ensuring Michael and Kate could never claim a single penny of her hard-earned wealth. The finality of it all settled on her like a comfortable weight. She had spent too many years allowing her family to control her emotions, her actions, but no more. Michael and Kate would no longer have access to her financial future. She wasn't going to let them drag her back into their toxic world. A week later, Ellie received a call from Grace, her lawyer. "Everything's set. It's all been updated, Ellie. You're completely protected. They won't be able to touch a thing." Ellie leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment. She could finally breathe freely. This is how it should have always been. But as soon as she thought that, she felt a familiar weight in the pit of her stomach. Michael and Kate wouldn't go quietly. She knew them well enough by now to know that they wouldn't let go of their expectations, their sense of entitlement without one final push. Her phone buzzed, and Ellie glanced at it. A text from Michael. "We've been through so much, Mom. Please reconsider. You don't want this to be the way things end between us." Ellie's heart didn't waver. She had heard this all before. They were trying to manipulate her using guilt to pull her back into their web. She stared at the screen for a long moment, almost as if expecting some part of her to react. But nothing came. She wasn't the same person who would have given in to this kind of pressure. She deleted the message without responding, as she had done with the others. This is over. Ellie's focus had shifted to a new purpose, one that was far more fulfilling than anything she had ever done for Michael and Kate. She threw herself into her new role as a mentor, working with young women who came from difficult financial backgrounds. She shared everything she knew: how to manage money, how to set boundaries, how to take control of their lives. There was something so empowering about it, something that made Ellie feel like she was finally living her truth. For years, she had given her energy to the wrong people, to people who never truly appreciated it. Now, she poured that energy into women who would use it to change their own lives for the better. The highlight of this new chapter came when Ellie published her memoir. It was an honest, raw telling of her journey, how she had been manipulated, how she'd learned to break free, and how she had fought for the life she now led. It was a story of resilience and independence, of reclaiming one's power. The book became a bestseller. Women across the country wrote to her, thanking her for sharing her story, for inspiring them to take control of their financial futures. Ellie's words became a guide for others who had been held back by their circumstances. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every woman who had ever felt trapped, who had ever been made to feel that their worth was tied to someone else's approval. Still, Michael and Kate didn't stop. They tried one last time, sending a long, pleading letter. They expressed their regrets, their hopes for reconciliation, the familiar promises of change. But Ellie didn't open it. She didn't need to read it. The life they wanted her to live was no longer hers to give. Instead, Ellie sat by the window in her penthouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She smiled to herself, a peaceful satisfaction settling in. Her legacy was secure. She had created something that couldn't be taken from her. And no matter how many times they tried to return, she knew one thing for certain: she was finally free. The message came on a quiet morning, just as Ellie was finishing her breakfast. She had just wrapped up a meeting with her charity's board, discussing the next phase of their global outreach. The day was off to a peaceful start, and the last thing she expected was a ping from Michael. But there it was, lighting up her phone screen. "We just wanted to make things right." Ellie stared at the message for a long time, her fingers resting on the screen as the words blurred in front of her. She knew what he was trying to do: appeal to the part of her that still cared, still hoped. He was asking for forgiveness, seeking reconciliation, but it all felt empty now. She didn't need to hear the same words again. She didn't need to explain herself or justify her choices. She had made it clear, long ago. There was nothing left to say. Her fingers hovered over the phone for a moment, but in the end, she did nothing. She simply put it down, letting it lie untouched. Silence for once was enough. As the days passed, Ellie's life continued to flourish. The peace she had so carefully built settled around her like a warm, comforting blanket. The phone calls from Michael and Kate had long since stopped, their desperate attempts fading into distant echoes. The boundaries she had set had held firm, and now she was free to focus on what truly mattered: herself and the work she was doing to change the lives of women around the world. She threw herself deeper into her charity, expanding its reach far beyond the local community. What had started as a small group of women mentoring each other was now a global movement. From New York to Nairobi, Ellie's message of empowerment and independence was reaching women who needed it the most. Her charity provided financial education, mentorship, and resources to women from all walks of life, giving them the tools to take control of their futures. Ellie was traveling more, meeting with leaders and activists, speaking at conferences, and sharing her journey of self-discovery. Each story she heard, each woman she met, reaffirmed her belief that her purpose was finally clear. The charity was her legacy, but so was the woman she had become, the woman who had refused to be held down by her past. She thought back to the days when she had been tethered by guilt, driven by the desire to keep her family close, to maintain a connection with people who didn't truly care about her. Now, all of that seemed like a distant memory. Her journey of self-discovery continued, but it wasn't just about breaking free anymore. It was about living fully, authentically, and on her own terms. She relished every moment of her newfound peace. The weight that had once pulled her shoulders down was now gone. A few months later, Ellie was invited to speak at a women's conference in London. It was a big event, one that brought together some of the brightest minds in business, activism, and leadership. Ellie was both nervous and exhilarated, but as she stood before the crowd, a sense of calm washed over her. This was her moment. She shared her story, the rise, the fall, and the rise again. She spoke of how she had rebuilt herself, not just as a businesswoman, but as a woman who had finally learned to live for herself. The crowd was captivated. Her words resonated deeply with so many. As she finished her speech, a standing ovation greeted her. Ellie felt a warmth spread through her, but it wasn't just pride. It was something deeper, something more lasting, contentment. She had fought for her peace, and now it was hers. She wasn't just living for herself, she was living for others too. As the applause died down and the crowd began to settle, Ellie realized how far she had come. She had not only reclaimed her life, but she had built something that would last. Her past no longer defined her. It was her future that mattered now. In the quiet moments that followed, as she walked off the stage, she knew one thing with certainty. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. Ellie sat at her desk, the soft hum of the city barely reaching her through the thick glass of her penthouse windows. Her business, which had started as a passion project, had grown into something much more, a movement empowering women worldwide. Ellie's name had become synonymous with financial independence and empowerment, and the recognition had come pouring in. Awards, invitations to speak at prestigious events, and messages from women all over the world. But amid all the accolades, Ellie still didn't feel the need to boast. It was the work she had done that mattered, the lives she had touched, the women who were now finding their own voices, their own strength. Her charity continued to expand, providing financial literacy, mentorship, and support to women who were struggling to find their footing. From New York to Nairobi, Ellie's message was one of self-reliance and independence. She was fulfilling her true purpose, and it felt like she was finally where she was always meant to be. But Michael and Kate's attempts to reach her never stopped. They tried again, sending a long, pleading letter, filled with half apologies and accusations. "We've been through so much, Ellie," Michael wrote. "Please reconsider. You don't want this to be the way things end between us." Ellie read the letter once, her heart remaining unchanged. She had heard these words before, too many times. The manipulation was clear, the guilt trips designed to lure her back into their toxic orbit. But Ellie had long since shed that skin. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her focus had shifted. It was no longer about Michael or Kate. It was about the women who were now depending on her, the lives she could change with every seminar, every mentorship session. She had spent years giving her energy to people who never truly valued it. Now, that energy was being used to empower others, and it felt right. Ellie had spent months writing the final chapters of her memoir, each word an act of liberation. It wasn't just a book. It was a declaration of everything she had survived and overcome. She wrote about the emotional toll, the manipulation, and the painful realizations that had led to her freedom. Her story was raw, honest, and it resonated with so many women who had faced similar struggles. When the memoir was released, it became an instant bestseller. Women across the country, and even globally, wrote to her, thanking her for sharing her truth, for showing them it was possible to reclaim their lives. Ellie's words became a lifeline for women who had felt powerless, who had lived in the shadows of someone else's expectations. But still, Michael and Kate didn't relent. They sent another letter, a final attempt to break through. "We're sorry for everything," Kate wrote, her words filled with regret, yet still cloaked in self-interest. "We're family, and this can't be the end." Ellie didn't open it. She didn't need to. She had created something far more meaningful than the empty promises they offered. She had built a legacy, not just of financial success, but of emotional strength. She had built a future she could be proud of. A few months later, Ellie was invited to speak at a global women's summit in London. The event was massive, attended by leaders in business, politics, and activism from around the world. Ellie had spoken at many events before, but this was different. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for. Standing on stage in front of thousands, Ellie shared her journey. She spoke not just about the triumphs, but about the hardships, the years of manipulation and self-doubt. Her story was not just about financial success, It was about regaining control of her life, her happiness, and her peace. The crowd hung on every word. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Ellie stood there, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was her victory, the culmination of years of work and sacrifice, and the standing ovation felt like the final confirmation that she had truly made it. That evening, as she sat alone in her penthouse, Ellie reflected on everything she had accomplished. She had fought for her peace, for her happiness, and for her future, and she had won. Her phone buzzed again. It was Michael's name. Another attempt to pull her back into their world, but Ellie didn't even look at it. She had nothing more to say. Her past was just that, past. The future was hers, and she was ready to embrace it fully, knowing that nothing, not even her family's relentless demands, could take it from her. Ellie smiled, taking a deep breath. The victory was hers, and it was more than enough. Ellie stood at the window of her penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the floor. It was a typical evening in Manhattan, but for Ellie, it felt like the first night of the rest of her life. The weight of the past, Michael, Kate, the years of manipulation, guilt, and sacrifice, had finally lifted. She no longer felt the tug of their expectations, the constant pressure to give, to appease, to sacrifice her own happiness. The relief was quiet, but profound. She could finally breathe, fully and freely. Her days were no longer measured by their demands. Instead, Ellie spent her time focusing on what she loved, mentoring young women, traveling, and building her business further. She had discovered a deeper sense of purpose, one that wasn't driven by the need to fix broken relationships, but by the desire to see others thrive. Her charity was flourishing, and the impact she was making felt more fulfilling than any amount of wealth or recognition could ever offer. Ellie had become a beacon of hope and strength for women who had once felt trapped in the same way she had. She shared her story of financial freedom, independence, and self-discovery, always emphasizing that they, too, had the power to break free from whatever held them back. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming their lives, their choices, and their peace. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk beside her. It was a reminder about an awards ceremony she would be attending later that week, another recognition of her contributions to women's empowerment. Ellie had lost count of how many awards she had received, but each one still felt meaningful. These weren't just accolades. They were proof that she had made the right choice, that her sacrifices had led her to something worth fighting for. Still, no matter how much she achieved, Ellie's thoughts often wandered back to Michael and Kate. They had become ghosts in her life, distant, fading, and ultimately irrelevant. Their presence, once so consuming, was now absent. The silent gap they left behind was more freeing than painful. She had given them enough of herself. It was time to live for herself. As Ellie readied herself for the evening event, she found herself smiling at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was confident, self-assured, and at peace. She had built her own success, no longer relying on anyone else to define her. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, and now she was thriving in a way she never thought possible. The awards ceremony was a celebration of her work, but as Ellie walked up to accept the honor, she realized it wasn't about the trophy in her hands. It was about the journey, the transformation, and the lives she had touched. The applause echoed in her ears, but it was the quiet internal applause she heard most clearly, the sound of her own soul, cheering for the victory she had won. That night, as Ellie sat at her desk reflecting on the evening's event, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her past was no longer a weight she carried. It was simply a part of her story, one that had shaped who she was but no longer defined her. She had rewritten the narrative, and now her life was hers to live. Ellie thought about all the women she had mentored, all the conversations she'd had, and how far she had come. She had been a prisoner to other people's expectations for so long, but now she was free, truly free. She looked out at the city skyline once more, the lights twinkling in the distance. Her future stretched out before her, wide open and filled with possibility. She didn't know what the next chapter would bring, but she was ready. She had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. She had found peace. And that was all she needed. The phone buzzed again, this time a message from one of the women she had mentored. "Your story inspired me today. Thank you for showing me what's possible." Ellie smiled to herself, a sense of satisfaction warming her heart. She had done it, and no one could take this peace from her. Not now, not ever. The sun was low in the sky as Ellie sat at her desk, finalizing the last of her plans for the future. Her pen hovered over the papers, but this time there was no hesitation. She had already mapped out the next phase of her life, one that would continue to empower women around the world long after she was gone. Her legacy was secure, and it wasn't defined by money or fame. It was defined by the lives she had touched, the voices she had helped find strength. Michael and Kate were nowhere to be found in Ellie's life anymore. Their calls, their letters, they had all faded into the background like distant echoes that no longer mattered. Ellie had cut the ties with precision, and now she could look back without any regret. Their absence wasn't painful anymore. It was peaceful. The guilt, the obligation, the weight they once held over her, it was gone. She'd made the right choice, and now she was free. As Ellie reflected on the choices she had made, she realized how far she had come. From the woman who had once lived in fear of rejection to the woman who had finally taken control of her own destiny. She thought of the years spent catering to the demands of others, of giving up parts of herself to maintain false connections. And then she thought of how far she had come from that life, how much strength it had taken to rebuild, to stand firm against the forces that tried to pull her back. Ellie had become the founder of a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering women to take control of their financial futures. What had started as a small group of like-minded individuals sharing resources and advice had blossomed into an international network. The organization provided women with the tools to break free from the cycles of financial dependence that had held them back for so long. Ellie had used her own story to fuel the work, showing women what was possible when they took control of their financial destinies. The charity's success was a testament to Ellie's belief that true empowerment wasn't just about financial freedom, it was about emotional freedom as well. It was about showing women that they could walk away from toxic relationships, from guilt, from fear, and build something for themselves that was worth more than anything they had ever been given. But Ellie wasn't done yet. She had always been determined to keep learning, to keep growing. And now, she was about to take another step forward. A letter arrived one morning, a formal invitation to meet with world leaders to discuss global women's rights and empowerment. Ellie's heart skipped as she read the contents. This was the recognition she had worked so hard to achieve, the kind of recognition that would open doors for her work to expand even further. She sat back, letting the letter fall onto the desk. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a symbol of everything she had fought for. It was proof that her message had reached beyond the people she had directly mentored. It had rippled outward, touching the lives of countless women she had never met. Gratitude washed over her. She thought of how much she had learned through all of this, how the very challenges that once seemed insurmountable had shaped her into the woman she had always needed to be. She felt proud, but not in the way she used to. It wasn't the external validation she had once craved. It was the internal peace, the satisfaction of knowing that she had built something meaningful, something lasting. As she stood at her window, looking out over the city, Ellie smiled. The skyline stretching out before her no longer seemed distant. It was hers, in a way it never had been before. This was her life, her work, and her future. She had not only survived the darkest parts of her past, but she had built something far greater in its place. The doorbell rang. snapping her from her thoughts. Another day, another chapter to begin. But this time, it was her story. And she was ready to write the next part with strength, clarity, and peace. Her past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. Ellie had taken control, and that, she realized, was her legacy. The soft glow of the city stretched before Ellie, the evening light casting shadows across her penthouse. As she stood at the window, she thought about everything she had built, the life she had fought for. It wasn't just the accolades or the growing success of her charity. It was the peace, the confidence in knowing that every step she had taken was her own. She had come full circle, from a woman weighed down by guilt and manipulation to someone who could look at herself with pride. Her phone buzzed and Ellie glanced at the screen. A message from Michael, another attempt. She had learned long ago not to let these attempts sway her, but even now, after all this time, the familiar sense of frustration welled up inside her. "We're family, Ellie. Why are you doing this? Don't you care about us anymore?" The message was the same as it had always been, an attempt to drag her back into their web. Ellie didn't respond. She had nothing left to say. Their voices, once so loud in her life, had become nothing more than distant echoes. She had long since realized that their version of family was one built on manipulation, not love. Their attempts to pull her back only reminded her how far she had come, and how much they had failed to understand. Instead of dwelling on them, Ellie turned her attention back to the future. She had created a life filled with meaning, one that allowed her to live on her own terms. She had surrounded herself with friends and colleagues who saw her for who she truly was, not for what she could provide. Her charity was thriving, reaching more women than ever before. She had made a lasting impact, helping women break free from financial dependence, just as she had. Women who had once felt like they had no options now had the tools and confidence to build their own futures. She had seen the transformation in their eyes, and it was what kept her going. That night, she celebrated her success, surrounded by the women whose lives she had changed. They gathered in her penthouse, laughing and sharing stories of triumph. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of excitement and gratitude. Ellie was no longer alone in her journey. She had built a community of strong, empowered women who would continue the work long after she had passed the torch. As the evening wound down, Ellie received a call she had been waiting for, an invitation to speak at the United Nations, to share her story with the world. The recognition was humbling, but what mattered most to Ellie was the platform it gave her to inspire even more women on a global scale. Her journey, her story of independence, of rising from manipulation and fear, had the power to reach beyond borders and change lives. Standing in front of the mirror later that evening, Ellie saw the woman she had become. Her reflection showed a face that had weathered storms, that had been shaped by struggle, but had emerged stronger than ever. The lines around her eyes were no longer signs of stress, but of resilience. She stood tall, no longer defined by anyone else's expectations, but by her own choices. A sense of pride washed over her. She had built this life, one based on strength, independence, and the unwavering belief that she was enough. She had built something worth celebrating, something that would outlast the manipulations of her past. For the first time in years, Ellie could finally say she had no regrets. The work she had done, the impact she had made, was enough. She had reclaimed her power and in doing so had built a legacy that would stand for generations. As she turned away from the mirror and walked back to the celebration in the other room, Ellie felt a quiet, contented peace settle deep inside her. She had found herself, and now the world was hers to change. The premiere of her documentary was a night Ellie had long awaited. She stood backstage, the hum of the crowd filtering through the walls, each person gathering in anticipation of the story they were about to witness. Ellie's journey, her transformation from a woman trapped in the grips of guilt and manipulation to one who had finally reclaimed her peace, was about to be shared with the world. The thought of it stirred something deep within her. Pride, yes, but also a quiet humility. This wasn't about accolades or the standing ovations that might follow. It wasn't even about the fame. This moment, this night, was the culmination of years of growth and sacrifice. Ellie had lived it. She had survived it. And now she was ready to share her story with others, to let them see the power of self-liberation. As the lights dimmed and the audience settled into their seats, Ellie stepped onto the stage. The room quieted, and a rush of emotion surged through her, nervousness, excitement, and the deep knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. This was no longer just her journey. It was a story that would resonate with millions. The screen flickered to life, and Ellie's story unfolded before her. She watched herself on screen, older, wiser, but unmistakably her. The raw footage captured the darkest moments of her life, the struggles with Michael and Kate, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding her life. It was vulnerable, deeply personal, but Ellie didn't look away. She had become the woman who could finally face it all without flinching. As the final scene played, showing Ellie standing tall in her penthouse, victorious and free, the audience erupted into applause. Ellie stood at the front of the room, her heart swelling with a quiet, steady pride. She had lived this story, and now it had the power to change lives. She took the microphone, her voice steady as she spoke to the crowd. "I stand before you tonight not as someone who has achieved perfection, but as someone who has found her truth, a truth that was buried under years of manipulation, fear, and guilt. But I dug it out. I fought for it, and if I can do it, so can you." Her words were met with a chorus of applause, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the tears in some of the women's eyes, the way they nodded in recognition. Ellie saw their stories reflected in hers, and she knew in that moment that her life had purpose. She had become the woman who could show others that they, too, could break free, could rebuild. The premiere ended, but the night wasn't over. Ellie spent the rest of the evening speaking with women who had come to her documentary with their own stories. She listened to them, offering advice, encouragement, and most of all, the unwavering belief that they could change their lives just as she had. She continued to mentor, teaching young women how to be financially independent and resilient in the face of adversity. Ellie had spent so much of her life making others' needs her own, but now she was focused on nurturing the women around her, helping them reclaim their power just as she had. Every conversation, every lesson was another piece of the legacy she was building. As the night wound down and Ellie stood by herself, reflecting on the evening, she thought back to where it all began. The woman she had once been, the one who was so terrified of being alone, of losing the approval of her family. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she barely recognized. Now, as she looked toward the future, she knew there would always be challenges, but they no longer frightened her. She had built something that couldn't be broken, something far more valuable than any material success or fleeting approval. She had built a life of freedom, of strength, and of independence. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Michael, another plea for reconciliation, for things to go back to how they once were. Ellie glanced at it briefly, then set the phone down. The message meant nothing to her anymore. She had done the work, she had healed, and her peace was hers to keep. Standing in front of the mirror that evening, Ellie saw the woman she had become, strong, resilient, unshaken by the past. The reflection staring back at her was no longer weighed down by guilt or obligation. She was free, truly free. "They thought they could break me," Ellie whispered to her reflection, a slow smile curling on her lips. "But I became the woman they could never touch." And with that, she embraced the future, unapologetically, unreservedly, and ready for whatever came next.